The CNBC app. Global market news in one place. Customizable sections and personalized alerts. Stocks tracking, interactive charts and market insights all in your hands. Stay connected. Stay informed. Download the CNBC app today.
A very warm welcome to this edition of Scorebox Europe. We've got Karen Cho and Juliana Tadelbaum in the London studio, myself, Steve Sedgwick, at the NATO Summit in The Hague. These are your headlines. Donald Trump heading to an absolutely pivotal NATO summit here in The Hague, with the Secretary-General Mark Rutte hailing the US president's big success as leaders back deeper defense spending. The Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson tells me he backs the move.
A significant increase is absolutely necessary right now, and I think 3.5 plus the 1.5 for a broader kind of security investments is a very accurate one.
President Trump insists Iran's nuclear sites were completely destroyed by US strikes, despite NBC sources suggesting the operation only set the country's nuclear program back by as little as 3 months.
And Wall Street rallies on signs the ceasefire is holding, while crude prices look to claw back some of this week's losses.
One on the agenda today, new plan when it comes to spending over the coming years. Of course, defense industrial production. We know that we are lacking a defense industrial base which is producing sufficiently. So we have fantastic companies, but we have to put in extra production lines. They have to put in the extra production lines. They have to put in the extra shifts in making sure that we produce the ammunition and all the items we need. And Ukraine, we will big at the summit today. Will be discussed, making sure that Ukraine over the coming years will continue to count on the support of NATO countries to keep them in the fight, but also make sure that we can bring Ukraine to a durable and lasting peace. So a transformational summit, looking forward to it, and of course hope to see you later today. I can now take a few questions, and then at the end we will see each other at the press conference. And I see that CNBC wants to start.
Thank you very much.
Sir.
Steve Sedgwick, CNBC, as you know, sir. Look, there's a lot of questions not feel they have the money in their budget to feel they have the money in their budget. 3.5%, let alone 5% in total as well. Do you fear that Spain could scupper this meeting and actually, sir, despite all your huge diplomatic efforts, incur the ire, the wrath of the United States?
No, I don't. I'm not worried about that. Of course, these are difficult decisions. Let's be honest. I mean, politicians have to make choices. It's harsh. And this is not easy because 7-8 countries at the start of this year not at 2%. They will now reach the 2% this year. Many of those countries said we will do it somewhere in the 2030s. They've now committed to do it this year. And already we added in an aggregate of $1 trillion since 2016. Since Trump 45 started his first presidency. But today, and this is the third stage, we will add trillions extra with this new plan. But of course, you're right. Countries have to find the money. It's not easy. These are political decisions. I totally recognize it. But at the same time, there's absolute conviction with my colleagues at the table that given the threat from the Russians, given the international security situation, there is no alternative. We've got to do this.
Does Mr. Sanchez appreciate it?
Mr. Rutte, why won't Mr. Trump back Article 5?
For me, there is
Article 5.
For me, there is absolute clarity that the United States is totally committed to NATO, totally committed to Article 5, and yes, there is also an expectation, which will be fulfilled today, that the Canadians and the Europeans will speed up their spending, making sure that we not only are able to defend ourselves against the Russians and others, but also to equalize. And this is fair, that we spend the same as the US is spending. Sir, yes. The big thing about Article 5 and the good thing about Article 5 is that it is clear that we defend each other when we are attacked. But you will always get all these questions, yes, but if this cyber attack or this hybrid attack, we never go into those details.
Secretary-General, you had
had dinner with Donald Trump yesterday. In what mood was he? And
excellent
do you
mood, and the King and Queen were hosting a fantastic dinner in this.
And
I was so proud to sit in that Orange Hall, which is basically exemplar. I'm a historian, so this is about the history of the Dutch Republic. 1648, the Münster peace deal, and the King made a fantastic speech. You have seen it, I hope. I was also able to say a few words, so I think it was a great dinner.
Nederland dit allemaal gaan betalen? 5%, meneer Rutte.
Nederland is op 2 of 3 na het rijkste land van de wereld. Als wij het al niet kunnen betalen, wat kunnen we dan van de anderen? Wij zijn schatrijk. Dankzij verstandig beleid over de laatste jaren.
Gaat het pijn doen, meneer Rutte? Staat de NAVO er onder Trump beter voor dan onder Biden?
Ik denk dat de NAVO na vandaag er sterker voor staat dan ooit sinds de val van de Berlijnse muur.
Meneer Rutte, heeft u nog meer persoonlijke berichtjes aan Trump gestuurd de afgelopen nacht die misschien niet openbaar worden?
Oh, spannend. We gaan het kijken. Maar ik heb er geen bezwaar tegen.
Maar heeft u er wel internationaal ook kritiek op gekregen?
Nee.
Want u toch een beetje schaamteloos. U zei van nou, de Europese landen die hebben die NAVO-norm die mooi dankzij u gehaald.
Ja, is toch waar?
Wat de Europese landen zoals Spanje die zeggen...
Hey, but listen, it's totally true. Would you really think that the 7 or 8 countries, not at 2%, at the beginning of this year, would have reached the 2% if Trump would not have been elected president of the United States? Do they really think that, of course, there is a threat from the Russians, China, etc., but that it would be doable to reach this commitment of 5% today? And I'm hopeful and cautiously optimistic we will get there. If Trump would not have been elected president, so I think what I said in the text message to him, totally fine that he published it, please, but totally fine that he published it, I think is a statement of fact.
Sharing this message. Are you okay with him sharing those SMS? Isn't that a little embarrassing?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. What is in that text message is a statement of fact, and I'm totally fine that he shared it.
Meneer Rutte, één laatste
The attacks on Iran appear to be less positive, less successful than they looked before. Do you reconsider your congratulations?
No, not at all. And the 14 huge bombs dropped on the nuclear facility of Iran, I think this was crucial to really do everything possible to take out the nuclear capability of the Iranians, which NATO has always said Iran should not get its hands on. And therefore this decisive action by the United States was so important.
Secretary-General, yesterday you told allies to stop worrying about the United States.
Yes.
But how can the allies stop worrying when Trump keeps relativizing Article 5 again and again?
I would think, look what the United States is doing, what Donald Trump is doing. They are spending almost $1 trillion on defense. They are by far the biggest contributor to NATO. They are delivering all the key enablers for NATO, also here in Europe. I mean, they are an important ally. They are by far the biggest ally in NATO. They are over 50% of the total NATO economy. But what we now will do over the coming years is to bring down, step by step, shift the burden away from the United States, more towards the Europeans and the Canadians, which I think is fair. And in the meantime, we will also equalize the spending. I think we now have to go because colleagues of mine, leaders of and presidents, I'm not a leader or a president, I'm only a Secretary-General, but still former colleagues of mine will enter this building and want to speak to you. But I thought the children were here. They are there. Yes, please, you ask the last question. Am I excited? I'm excited, but to a level where I can still...
A vast amount of questions, including from some very young journalists who have just arrived here as well. So part of, I guess, the outreach program from NATO. But there were some very, very important interventions there as well. Of course, CNBC got the first question into the Secretary-General, and he said, look, I think there isn't a problem with Spain, and obviously countries have struggled to get to 2%. And that's a really important point as well. Getting to these targets has been very, very difficult for many countries. When Donald Trump became the president first time round became the first president, Trump 45, and he came to the Brussels meeting of NATO in July 2018. Of course, there was a lot of concern that he had about the lack of spending across Europe, and especially from the likes of Germany, which was, of course, taking vast amounts of cheap gas and oil from the Russians, but actually was taking US defense. And since then, look what's happened. I mean, we've now got a firm Atlanticist as the Chancellor in Germany, Friedrich Merz, who has promised pretty much and ending open financing for the military, for the Bundeswehr, to reinvigorate what was a very woeful German military, and of course the 500 billion euro infrastructure fund. So you've got the most powerful economy in Europe spending stunning amounts of money, getting itself up to the kind of levels of spending that the Americans are requiring from European allies. And it's very interesting to see what he said to me about the Spain question as well, and what he said to other journalists here as well. And actually, he thinks there are many paths to get to 3.5% of military spending and defence, and to get the extra 1.5% on infrastructure as well. So he doesn't think there will necessarily be a problem with Spain, as in one country versus 31 as well. Interesting that another journalist was asking also about those texts, saying, was it embarrassing? And we talked about this a little bit earlier on in Europe Early Edition. And the fact is, that is diplomacy. If you want the biggest, most important man in the world, arguably, but let's say he is, for the sake of this argument, Donald Trump, to stay on board with the huge military expenditure that the US is making in Europe, then of course that is part and parcel. You have to show diplomacy. We can all go back to Renaissance Italy, if you like, and look at Niccolo Machiavelli and the Prince, and that's how this stuff works, ladies and gentlemen. But until we get our next arrival, which we're expecting fairly soon, why don't I hand it back to Juliana and Karen, because there's a few other business stories and, of course, markets to look at in the studio.
Yeah. No, Steve, thank you very much for that. Just pick up on the point around Article 5. And of course, we're clearly watching if there's going to be any pushback from President Trump around that definition. And this is what he was talking to some reporters about, the founding principle around NATO. Is there a suggestion that if there is an attack on a NATO country, that the United States will not come to the rescue of that said country? And I think what we've seen all along since the war in Ukraine, that has been a chief concern of European countries, that NATO must hold, and any encroachment on countries part of the alliance, there must be full support. But with what capabilities, and Steve was mentioning there, the capabilities of extra spending of nations, but it's going to take a long time before you see the ability of these nations to stand on their own 2 feet, if ever, without some sort of nuclear capability that the US would bring to the table.
I think the Article 5 issue is central to why NATO works. That's the ultimate deterrent when it comes to NATO, this core principle that if one nation is attacked, then you have the support of NATO there to back it up and support it. And that's what makes NATO work. Let me throw back to Steve, who is on the sidelines there. And Steve, maybe you want to weigh in on this.
Yeah, I think you make a very good point, but let's make the other very obvious point that actually there are vast numbers of US military personnel, we're at bases like Ramstein and elsewhere, across these NATO countries anyway. So if you were to see an attack on NATO territory, well, US troops are already there. They're already potentially engaged as well. So it's very important to point that out as well. It's not a question of the US coming in to support those nations. The US is already here, and that, as we say, has been the bedrock of the last 76 years in the NATO alliance. I think we're getting one or two more arrivals here now, so I'm just going to hand it back to you guys in the studios. So I wait to see whether we can get a question into further delegates, prime ministers and presidents.
Steve, thank you very much for that. Yes, indeed, we are getting a lot of arrivals at this hour, and we're going to get more commentary, no doubt, as well. But just what it looks like in terms of that US commitment. I mean, the reality is we've seen a very isolationist US policy, and that is on trade, and now the tone on defence as well. So the market clearly looking to see if there are any shifts in focus here. This is the Dutch Prime Minister, so let's just see if he is going to be taking any questions from the media, if he's going to give a statement as well that we can listen into. Clearly behind the microphone there, but let's listen in and see what he's saying.
We are this day, I hope it will be an historic day for the reinforcement of our alliance. And that we are going to work very good in our alliance on strengthening our deterrence and our defense. I think it's absolutely necessary, and to make sure that we share the burden more financially, but also in our military tasking. So, as the Netherlands is concerned, we want to achieve two things today. Unity on the decision for the 3.5% and 1.5%, and at the same time make sure that we really ramp up also our defense industry, so that we're capable to strengthen our defense in itself. And that behind the backdrop of what's happening in Europe with the Russian aggression war going on in Ukraine. And at the same time, I want to say that I'm proud that the NATO Summit is in The Hague. and that all the people living in The Hague, they share the burden also a little bit. And I'm very proud of everybody, the police, the military, all the volunteers and professionals that are working to make this day quite a success. Thank you.
CNBC, sir, do you fear that that unity that you crave, that you said is absolutely pivotal, can happen at this meeting, given the fact that we already know that your friend Pedro Sanchez of Spain actually has said that Spain cannot get to those levels? Do you think that unity will happen today?
Yeah, I'm absolutely sure. Because what you agree on is that we need the capabilities. As Spain said, they think they can manage it with another amount of financing. We think we need the 3.5% and 1.5%. So I think we still share we will deliver unity today. Absolutely.
How confident are you that all the allies will actually be able to implement the 5% by 2035?
I think we can. It's still a long time. I mean, it's in relation to our security, 10 years is quite a long time. So I think we should all step up our defense spending, and we should reach the 3.5% and 1.5%. But what's important is that defense spending is related to the capabilities we defined we need to make sure we get our deterrence and our defense in the right position. I will switch to Dutch. Ja, dat is moeilijk te zeggen. Er zijn verschillende opties om de uitgaven te doen.
There, who is the Prime Minister of the Dutch Prime Minister, and just make the point, he's talking about unity at NATO. They haven't even got unity at home. They've had to call fresh elections that are coming up in October after Geert Wilders decided to pull the pin on the coalition. So this is the challenge in Europe as we talk about some sort of unity country by country at a NATO alliance level. The priorities domestically in a lot of these countries are also being challenged by some of the politics, populist politics that are come into the fray. And don't forget, some of the angles here are really around the geopolitics from the likes of Russia, the angles we've seen in some of these countries, those actors really driving populist sentiment in some areas, particularly around the far right. So I think it's fascinating that he's calling for this unity when, let's face it, there are challenges at home.
I think there's certainly challenges at home in Spain's case, which has come to the fore at this NATO summit, with Spain getting the exception here, and a lot of criticism around that coming from the Trump administration. We're going to take a break, but our coverage of the NATO summit will continue throughout the program. Coming up on the show, how is the fragile ceasefire deal between Israel and Iran holding, and did the U.S. overplay the extent of its attack on Iran's nuclear facilities? We'll discuss all that with Dan in Dubai. Plus, Tesla sales continue to slump in Europe, now down 45% year to date, while Volvo cars and Stellantis also post soft sales. And with all eyes on President Trump at today's NATO leaders meeting, we'll be discussing what America's strategy is for Europe with Mitchell Reese, Distinguished Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Welcome back to Squawk Box Europe. Well, it was a blockbuster day stateside yesterday. We saw the tech-heavy NASDAQ post a fresh record close. And NVIDIA had the biggest positive impact on that index. 10 out of 11 sectors in the U.S. overall were positive on the session, led by technology shares. So you can see the Dow Jones, the S&P 500, and the NASDAQ all ended more than 1% higher. Putting this into the context of this month's moves, the NASDAQ is now up more than 4% month to date, on pace for its third positive month in a row. So despite all the uncertainty around trade, despite the conflict in the Middle East, we are seeing investors put money back into the U.S. market. And so it looks like that U.S. exceptionalism trade is not over yet. Moving on to Asia. What's happening in the Asian trade overnight? Well, you've got green across the board there as well. So taking their cue from Wall Street yesterday, you've got the Hang Seng in Hong Kong up more than 1% in overnight trade. The Shanghai Composite in mainland China up by about 0.7%, and a little bit more muted gains, but gains nevertheless for the Japanese and South Korean markets. What does it all mean for Europe? Let's take a look at the European futures and what things look like right now. We've got green here as well, and this follows a rebound yesterday for the Stoxx 600. It gained 1.1%, the best daily performance since the middle of May. The index still down, though, 1.4% on the month. So over the month of June, we have seen strong outperformance of U.S. markets versus European markets. A very different trend to what we saw at the start of the year. Taking a look at oil markets and where things stand here. Yesterday, Brent and WTI both retreated about 6% apiece. Now this morning, a little bit of a bounce in Brent and WTI, both up about 1 and 1.4% or so.
Backdrop to that, as US strikes on 3 Iranian nuclear facilities were not as effective as suggested by US President Donald Trump, according to leaked documents. NBC sources say an initial assessment by the Defense Intelligence Agency concluded the operation set Tehran's nuclear program back by only 3 to 6 months. Trump doubled down on his claim that the sites have been completely destroyed in a post on Truth Social, criticizing CNN and the New York Times, which were among the outlets to report on the assessment. This as a shaky ceasefire between Iran and Israel appears to be holding. Let's get out to Dan for more for the latest. Dan, it is quite a significant difference between obliterated versus degraded as we talk about the enrichment facilities nuclear program for the Iranians. What are you hearing and what's the response in the region been?
Well, Karen, you asked me directly about this earlier on in the week, and it was the right question to ask because we've just seen this new leaked intelligence suggesting some of the damage from those strikes on the 3 Iranian nuclear facilities may have been exaggerated. NBC News reports a Defense Intelligence Agency assessment actually found that this attack only set Iran's nuclear program back by 3 to 6 months. That is far less than the completely and totally obliterated claim that the president pushed earlier this week. Now, Trump has, of course, hit back on social media, as you've just said, doubling down on his own version of events and also blasting media organizations that reported otherwise. Hours earlier as well, we also heard the president lashing out at Israel and Iran for violating the terms of his truce. Listen to this.
Israel, as soon as we made the deal, they came out and they dropped a load of bombs, the likes of which I'd never seen before. The biggest load that we've seen. I'm not happy with Israel. You know, when I say, okay, now you have 12 hours, you don't go out in the first hour and just drop everything you have on them. So I'm not happy with them. I'm not happy with Iran either. But I'm really unhappy if Israel's going out this morning because the one rocket that didn't land, that was shot, perhaps by mistake, that didn't land. I'm not happy about that. You know what? We basically have 2 countries that have been fighting so long and so hard that they don't know what the they're doing. Do you understand that?
So you heard there the president clearly frustrated at the state of play on the ground here. Nevertheless, the fragile truce between Israel and Iran appears to be holding, at least for now. As for the political fallout in the United States, well, NBC News sources also say that initial intelligence reporting does not indicate that all of Iran's uranium has been destroyed or even accounted for. And of course, there's still plenty of questions about Iran's advanced centrifuges as well, their location still unknown. Now, what happens next here remains to be seen. You do get the general sense that the appetite for escalation on both sides is seemingly low, and this ceasefire may in fact hold, but of course, uncertainty remains over exactly what comes next. What we're seeing now is some money moving back into the oil markets. Perhaps that suggests that these markets were a little oversold yesterday. They have come down very significantly over the last 2 trading sessions, with the risk premium in oil essentially being evaporated as a result of this ceasefire news. But remember as well, any renewed fighting could mean fresh supply shocks for energy and more volatility across global markets. So, of course, traders watching the headlines really quite closely.
Dan, let me pick you up on what's been happening in oil markets. Yesterday, we saw Brent and WTI come down by about 6%. And I was just reading a note from Deutsche Bank that the decline in oil yesterday got some extra momentum from Trump's post that China can now continue to purchase oil from Iran, suggesting that the U.S. might reduce enforcement of sanctions against Iranian oil. Can you give us a little bit more detail on what the outlook is like in terms of Iranian oil returning to the market?
Indeed. So the president also walked back those comments as well. He said he didn't necessarily misspeak, but actually meant that Iran would be able to continue buying oil as long as it was from the United States. Of course, Iran still exports what oil it does have to the global markets. Its primary buyer is China. What we've seen in the last couple of years is a shadow fleet of tankers being established. They strip the names off these ships, they repaint them, they turned off the transponders so they can't be detected in international waters, and we're still seeing millions of barrels a day flowing into the Chinese mainland and these teapot refiners, which of course the US Treasury has been sanctioning heavily for several years now in order to try and stop those flows. But China is the lifeblood of the Iranian regime. They continue to buy Iranian oil, and what we're going to see perhaps in the next few months is maybe more US sanctions being leveled towards that illicit trade. Where the president stands on this is also a question mark at this point, because we don't exactly know what his current position is. You mentioned that perhaps he has suggested that the Chinese can continue to buy Iranian oil, but as I said, he walked that back and suggested instead that it should be US oil that continues to be sold on the global market. So watch that space.